The billionaire was halfway to the computer lab when he heard it, a delicate clink that didn't belong in a lunchroom. He turned and saw a little girl with a faded unicorn lunchbox, holding not food but 3 marbles and a folded scrap of paper. On it, written in a child's hand, "This lunchbox is for being brave. If it's not your day, hold the marbles so people think it is. Be kind, it's only hunger." In that moment, Adrian Cole's world and everything he thought money could fix shifted forever. He didn't notice the little girl until the lid of her lunchbox tipped open and the clink of something that wasn't food chimed against the metal like a delicate bell. Adrian Cole had been walking the length of the cafeteria with the principal, taking in the bright posters, the hair-netted women, ladling tiny scoops of mashed potatoes, the rows of tables painted in primary colors, already halfway back in his head to an afternoon of earnings calls and board notes. He wore the kind of navy suit that held its sharpness like a secret salt and pepper hair smoothed in a line that said he was used to moving through rooms where problems were achievements and numbers obeyed. He wasn't here for the cameras. The school was one of 100 his foundation had wired for high-speed internet, and the principal had invited him to see the new computer lab. It should have been 20 minutes, shake a few hands, say a few words, leave a check behind. Instead, he heard that small metal chime and turned, and the world he knew shifted 2 degrees off-center. The little girl sat alone at the end of a too-long table, knees together, socks puddled at her ankles, a faded unicorn glittering on the front of her shirt. The lunchbox was pink once, the color bleached out by the sun, stickers of stars peeled half away. She had opened it on her lap and was peering inside with a focus that looked like prayer. When Adrian stopped, she looked up, then down again quickly, as if she'd been caught with something illicit. The lid wobbled in her small hands. Inside, there was no sandwich, no fruit cup, no thermos. There were 3 glass marbles, one blue, one green, one as clear as a drop of rain, and a folded square of paper. He might have kept walking. He might have pretended he hadn't seen. But a man can move through 1,000 rooms and not feel a thing, then stumble over a single small truth and be undone. The principal, Miss Ramirez, was already turning to steer him toward the lab. "Mr. Cole, the 5th graders made thank-you cards for you." "1 second," he said, and his own voice surprised him with its softness. He crouched, careful to keep his distance, the way you approach a starling that might fly. "Hey," he said to the girl, "I like your lunchbox." She lifted her head again. Her eyes were the specific brown of late afternoon tea. "It's old," she said after a moment, as if that answered the question he hadn't asked. "I have an old briefcase," he said. "It's lucky." He nodded towards the box. "What's inside?" The girl pressed her lips together, thinking. "Just my stuff," she said. Then, as if she'd been told that secrets were safer when you made them small, "Marbles. They're beautiful." He didn't reach for them. He didn't touch the paper either, though the paper was suddenly the only thing in the room his eyes seemed to know how to see. He'd been a boy with secrets once, the kind you folded into careful squares and carried until the edges became soft, and your hands remembered the shape in the dark. "Where's your lunch?" he asked, and immediately wished he'd chosen different words. Her shoulders tightened, the tiny flinch of a child bracing for disappointment. She looked down at the marbles again. "It's not my day," she said. Miss Ramirez closed her eyes barely. Then she stepped in quickly, a practiced smile wedged onto her face. "Why don't we go see the lab now?" she said brightly. "Mr. Cole has a busy schedule." "Whose day is it?" Adrian asked, not standing. The girl blinked at him. Her fingers brushed the marbles like they were pets. "We take turns," she said. "My brother had breakfast yesterday. My sister has lunch today." She chewed at the side of her lip as if working through a problem set. "Tomorrow is my day again, so it's okay." "May I see the paper?" he asked, and somehow it came out steady. She hesitated, then nodded the tiniest nod, and he picked it up like you lift a newborn, 2 fingers, a breath held to keep from shaking. The paper was lined, torn from a spiral notebook. On the first line, in blocky pencil letters, was written, "This lunchbox is for being brave." On the next, "If it's not your day, Hold the marbles so people think it is. On the last line, in smaller writing that had pressed so hard the words dented the page, "Be kind, it's only hunger." He didn't realize he had sat back on his heels until the cold of the tile floor found his bones. The cafeteria noise, the clatter and scrape, the hum of voices, went distant, like he was underwater. The letters blurred once, then again, and before he could pull his face into the arrangement he wore in rooms where he was expected to be made of iron and timing, tears fell soundlessly onto the folded square. He had not cried in years. He had not cried when his company crossed a valuation that began with 100 and a number. He had not cried when a board member tried to break him in the press, or when a person he loved had decided to love a steadier life. But he cried then because a child had engineered an illusion to protect her siblings from embarrassment, and a word as big as hunger had been set aside like an optional assignment. Miss Ramirez put her hand on his shoulder and squeezed, a brave thing to do to a billionaire in front of 100 kids. He folded the paper back the way he'd found it, careful to return it exactly, and slid it into the lunchbox. "What's your name?" he asked. "Maya," she said, her chin tilted up a fraction. She was trying not to look at the wetness on his cheeks. "I'm Adrian," he said. "I think we didn't get proper introduced." "Are you the internet man?" she asked, and he almost laughed. "Some days." She pressed the marbles into her palm until the skin whitened. "My mom says not to take food if you can't pay," she added quickly, as if this were the test and she wanted to pass. He nodded. "Your mom sounds like a good person." "She is," Maya said fiercely, and the fierceness undid him more than the tears had. On the surface, the next hour proceeded as planned. He let the fifth graders show him the coding games they'd learned, shook hands with the PTA president, smiled for a photo he'd pay to keep out of the press. But every minute, his mind returned to a lunchbox with 3 marbles and a commandment someone had written in pencil and love. When the bell rang for recess, he found Miss Ramirez again. "Is this common?" he asked quietly. It was a dumb question, and he knew it. She didn't scold him for it. "We have kids who owe lunch money," she said flatly. "We're not allowed to refuse them food, but we're allowed to give them a different meal. They call it an alternative lunch. The kids call it the cold shame. Some of them would rather pretend they ate at home." "What's Maya's situation?" He knew that was an intrusive question. He asked it anyway, in the tone that said he could be trusted with a tax return and a confession. Miss Ramirez folded her arms, her eyes tracking a pair of boys chasing each other with the wild joy that comes from sugar and a 10-minute sky. Her mom, Alina, works nights at a packaging plant across town and days at a laundry 2 bus routes away. There are 3 kids. The rent went up. The father isn't in the picture. She hates charity because it comes with opinions. The principal's mouth twitched. "I tried to slip a grocery gift card into a holiday card last year." She slipped it back into my mailbox with a thank you note and a bag of homemade tamales. "So she pays in dignity," he said softly, and Miss Ramirez's eyes sharpened like she was recalibrating him. "You seem like a good man," she said, which is what people say when they are reminding you that goodness is measured in what you do next. "But if this becomes a photo op, I'll throw reporters off the roof." He smiled without humor. "You won't need to. They know I prefer roofs without people." He didn't go back to the office. He called his assistant from the school parking lot, the heat off the asphalt rising in waves. "Clear my afternoon," he said, "and do something else. Find me every document, contract, and policy related to the district's food service. Procurement, vendors, debt collection, alternates. All of it. Be impolite." "Understood," said Grace, who had long ago decoded the difference between his impatience and his fury. "And your 2 o'clock with Zurich?" "Tell Zurich I discovered the concept of tomorrow." He drove not to his penthouse or his office tower, but to a grocery store. He walked the aisles with a cart like any other man, except his cart began to look like a person trying to fix an ocean with bottled water. He put in peanut butter and bread, and fruit, and a bag of rice, and 3 boxes of spaghetti, and jars of sauce and the kind of cereal that came with a cartoon promise of vitamins. He added fresh vegetables because he wanted to, and knew he shouldn't be the one deciding. He paid, tipped the kid who loaded the car like he was shipping a sensitive instrument, and then he sat in the driver's seat with his hands on the wheel. He wasn't sure whether to drive to Maya's address, which Miss Ramirez had written down on a post-it with a look that said she would judge him forever by what he did with it, or to go home, call a fleet of people, and move dollars the way he moved code. He decided to do both. Alina's apartment was on the third floor of a building that had been recently painted, as if a fresh color could be a lease that didn't squeeze. Maya's brother opened the door, short and serious, eyes old enough to have seen a lot of calendars. "We don't buy," he announced. "I'm not selling," Adrian said. "I brought groceries." He waited because entrance is not a right that comes with money. After a moment, the boy stepped back. Alina stood by the sink, hands still wet from rinsing, expression wary enough to stop a car. She wore a gray T-shirt and the same ferocious dignity that had been implied in a cafeteria. "Hello?" she said carefully. "You are the internet man?" Adrian smiled. "Some days." "We have internet," she said, which was fact and also line drawing. "Do not assume deficits because we are poor." "I know," he said. "I came because I saw your daughter's lunchbox." Her chin lifted. "We are okay," she said, and he realized the phrase was a fortress built out of stubborn bricks. "I brought some food," he said, "not because you can't provide, because I can." He waited for the no. It didn't come. Instead, she exhaled, shoulders dropping half an inch, a concession and a grace, and nodded toward the counter. He placed the bags down. Maya and her brother looked in without touching anything, like people look at museum cases, reverent and half convinced that the display isn't really for them. Maya's little sister toddled in and immediately hugged a box of pasta like a stuffed animal. Alina brushed wet hair back from her face. "We take turns," she said, not as an explanation but as a philosophy. "I don't want my children to be greedy. They must know what it means to share." "I saw the note in the lunchbox," he said. "It's extraordinary." She closed her eyes for a heartbeat. They wrote it together. So nobody has to feel like they are the only one who doesn't have. He told her he wanted to help, and he used the word now and the word later, and he waited for her to pick which one was acceptable. She chose neither. "I don't want cameras," she said. "I don't want people to think I can't feed my children." "It's not about you," he said gently. "It's about the fact that a school district let something called cold shame exist as a policy." She frowned. "They give food. It is not good, but it is food." He nodded. "Food that teaches a child she is a debt." He met her eyes. "I can write a check and erase numbers. That's easy. What I want is to erase the part that makes a child carry marbles to pretend she isn't hungry." She didn't smile, but something softened. "What will you do?" He told her the truth. "I don't know yet." Then, because he had built empires out of the sentence that followed, "But I will." By nightfall, his living room looked like a war room. Grace had commandeered the big table and spread out contracts and flow charts and sticky notes like a detective tracking a fugitive through his aliases. 2 members of his legal team sat with their laptops open, scrolling through clauses and subclauses. A consultant he trusted with no's more than yeses, an older woman named Candace, who had audited school districts in 3 states, took off her glasses and said, "It's always the same 2 tricks, predatory contracts and shame as leverage." "Explain," Adrian said, because he liked his anger organized. "The district contracts with a vendor that low bids to win and then inflates through change orders and junk fees. The vendor supplies pre-packaged meals that meet minimal state requirements and maximize margins. The alternate lunch exists to enforce debt collection. It's a psychological penalty designed to push delinquent families into paying." "So the cold sandwich is a debt collector," Adrian said, and Candace nodded. "Also," Grace said, tapping a highlighted page with a pen, "there's a clause that lets the vendor resell surplus food back to themselves through a distributor they own. It's legal because someone made it legal." "Names," Adrian said. Grace slid a list across the table. Board members who voted yes, procurement officers who signed fast, vendor executives, the law firm that wrote this. Adrian read, lips tightening at a surname he recognized. Of course, he said softly. They play golf with the people who decide what kids eat. He had built a career on speed, on the understanding that sometimes you defeated an opponent by moving so fast the other party was still composing an email while you'd already signed a deal. But this would require something different, precision and patience, because mistakes here would cut the wrong throats. He leaned back, eyes on the ceiling, thinking of 3 glass marbles and a folded paper that had used the word kind, like a declarative sentence. 2 tracks, he said finally. Immediate relief and systemic change. Immediate relief. We clear every lunch debt in the district before the bell rings on Monday. I do it through a nonprofit, not mine, so it can't be framed as a vanity move. No names. He looked at Grace. Find one that will let us wire by morning. On it, she said, already typing. Systemic change. We replace the vendor, not by writing a bigger check, but by building a better model. He glanced at Candace. Scratch-cooked meals, local sourcing where possible, universal free breakfast and lunch, because the administration of income-based anything costs more than feeding everyone when done at scale. Central kitchen, cold chain logistics. We'll start with this district, then open source the model. Candace smiled crookedly. You'll make someone very rich by showing them how to do it. Good, Adrian said, as long as it's the right someone. And while we build, he looked at the list of names. We investigate, not to punish, to prevent. If a man profits by serving a child a shame sandwich, he should find his calendar empty. He spent the weekend as if he were 22 again, sleeping in small pockets, making whiteboards speak, calling people who owed him favors and people he owed apologies to, and people who would tell him the ugly truth. He visited the warehouse district with his operations lead, a woman named Imani, who could make a logistic map out of a pencil and a napkin. They walked through a shuttered bakery and breathed in the ghost of sugar, and imagined stainless steel lines, kettles big enough to bathe in, a bright clockwork that would turn raw food into lunch without cruelty. On Sunday afternoon, he went back to Alina's apartment. He didn't come with cameras or a speech. He came with a notebook and listened. He asked her what her kids actually ate, what food they missed, what made lunchtime feel like joy, rather than a minute they had to muscle through. He asked her if she would help design the program, training paid, position guaranteed if it worked. She looked at him as if he had offered her a job in a place she thought was locked to her forever. I can't fail, she said almost to herself. If I fail, it gets on my children. He shook his head. You've been succeeding on a hard mode the rest of us don't even know how to log into. On Monday morning, the lunch debt was gone. The number was smaller than the headlines that would later be written about it, but it purchased something bigger than bread. Oxygen. Miss Ramirez called him, voice thick. A mother came in crying, she said. She thought we were calling the cops. We told her balance was 0. She kept asking what the catch was. There isn't one, he said. That's not how hunger should be negotiated. By Wednesday, his team had assembled a coalition that included the county health department, 2 local chefs who had grown up on free lunch and wanted to make the next generation's trays look like pride, a union of cafeteria workers whose members cried when someone asked them about dignity, and a logistics company that had been shipping pharmaceuticals in temperature-controlled trucks for 15 years and had always wanted to do something their kids would brag about. They called the pilot Full Bellies, Full Futures. He hated the name at first. Too cute. Then Maya wrote it on her lunchbox with a black marker, and the name became a promise, and his objections dissolved. The vendor fought. Of course they did. They hired a PR firm that specialized in kneecapping do-gooders and sent out statements about well-intentioned overreach and unintended consequences, and public-private partnerships that had a proven track record of safety. They accused Adrian of trying to privatize children. He didn't answer them. He put cafeteria workers and school nurses in front of microphones, And they said sentences like, "We watch kids faint at 1 o'clock," and the PR firm statements read like satire. At the first school board hearing, he didn't sit at the head of the room. He sat at the back beside Alina, who had wrapped her hair in a blue scarf and folded her nervous hands in her lap, and he listened while parents lined up to say what shame tasted like. A boy's grandmother with a cane and a church hat spoke a single sentence: "Jesus didn't ask for a co-pay." And the room laughed and cried at once. When it was his turn, he stood only because you cannot reboot a system by speaking from the hallway. "Feeding children is not a policy problem," he said. "It's a moral reflex. We don't ask a child to produce a W-2 when she breaks her arm. We set the bone." He didn't mention his name or his company. He didn't mention numbers. He talked about marbles, though he never once said the word. He called them small stones that let a child pretend the world is softer than it is. And somewhere in the third row, Maya squeezed Alina's hand. A whistleblower came forward, a truck driver with a belly like a barrel and hands that looked like they could lift a house. He talked about pallets of food left in the sun for hours, then passed along anyway. A cafeteria manager named Tilda brought a shoebox filled with pictures, mold-on-bread meat that had sweated gray long before it reached the warming tray. She said, "We tell them, eat, it's what we've got. Then we go home and count our God." The vendor's executive tried to counter with a PowerPoint about economies of scale. He might as well have read from a book about weather to a room full of people standing in the rain. When the board voted to terminate the contract and approve the pilot, the applause felt like a wind that finally blew in the right direction. Miss Ramirez hugged him hard enough to crease his suit. Reporters wanted quotes about his generosity. He said, "Talk to the people in hairnets. They're the experts." Later that night, he opened an email from a man whose name appeared on the contract. It said, "You just slandered my company." He typed and deleted 3 responses before settling on, "Providing edible food to children is not slander. It is civilization." The kitchen went live in 6 weeks, a feat that would have been impossible if not for the fact that once you tell the truth out loud, the right people sprint. The first day they cooked for 4 schools. The menu was simple: chicken and rice, roasted carrots, apples that weren't mush, milk that was cold. The cafeteria workers cried again, but this time the tears tasted like salt and relief. Maya stood at the front of the line, lunchbox in hand, and said to Adrian with ceremonial seriousness, "It's my day." He laughed properly for the first time in a month. The marbles, he learned, had belonged to their father. They had found them in a drawer after he left, and for a while the marbles were just marbles, things you roll across a floor and chase. Then, when food had gone thin, the 3 had placed 1 marble in each of their pockets on the days they didn't eat, so the weight would trick their bodies into feeling less empty. He didn't tell them that bodies can't be fooled. He told them that soon it wouldn't matter what day it was. He kept the paper in his wallet, folded the way Maya had folded it, the dents of the words a braille he could read in the dark. When meetings grew stale or fights grew stupid, he would touch the paper like a man touches a talisman, not for magic, but for aim. He did not pretend they had solved hunger. He is not the kind of man who confuses the brightness of a room for the breaking of a dawn. The kitchen had setbacks. A refrigeration unit failed, and a week of yogurt turned on them. A shipment of carrots arrived at half weight because a farm had lost workers to a flu. A local radio host called the program "Socialism in a Chef's Hat," and a state senator repeated the phrase because it fit neatly into a fundraising email. They adjusted. They built redundancies. They invited the senator to eat. He declined and called him a billionaire looking for sainthood. Adrian laughed in his car alone. On a Tuesday in October, he watched from the loading dock as steam rose from enormous pots, as women and men stirred with paddles the size of oars. Alina, now an operations coordinator with a badge clipped to her shirt, and a confidence that made the room shape itself around her, flipped through clipboards and told people what to do without apology. She had hired 3 single mothers from her building and 1 retired man who had wanted a place to stand where his hands would remember how to be useful. She wore a necklace that Maya had made from string and plastic beads spelled Future, the space between the letters uneven, but the intention exact. He liked being at the kitchen because here, finally, his mind slowed down to the speed of matter. You can move money in a blink. Food takes its time, and in that time, something like community can find its footing. He took instruction from a chef with a tattoo of a ladle on his forearm and learned to chop onions without crying, which felt like a paradox he appreciated. It should have been enough, and maybe for some men it would have been. A nobly executed program, a check on a list, a press release that glowed. But an unexpected thing happened when you fed people without conditions. Other problems walked in the door and said, "Now me." The kitchen sprouted after-hours classes on nutrition, then English language lessons where the flashcards had pictures of food and the vocabulary of dignity. A counselor started a group for parents who had carried too much for too long. A woman opened a sewing circle that became a micro-business that made aprons for the staff in bright colors that looked like celebration. He didn't run any of that. He had the grace to understand when he wasn't the one who belonged at the front of the room. He signed leases, he fixed roofs, he listened, he learned. He cut through red tape, not because he enjoyed cutting, but because the tape was strangling people. One afternoon in late winter, cold enough to make the steam from the kettles look like breath itself, Maya came to the kitchen after school and stood by the table where he was pretending to be useful with potatoes. She had her lunchbox with her, the unicorn now covered in new stickers from the program. "I have something," she said, formal. He wiped his hands and tried to kneel, then realized his legs were sore and sat on a milk crate instead. "What do you have?" She opened the lunchbox. The marbles were still there, but they had company now, a small plastic dinosaur, half its tail missing, a gold star sticker that had lost its stick, and a new folded piece of paper. She handed him the paper with both hands. He unfolded it. The handwriting had improved, but the pencil still pressed the kind of lines that mean a child wants the world to listen. "This lunchbox is for being brave," it said at the top, the same first line. On the next, "If it is your day, find someone whose day is not, and sit with them." On the last line, "Be kind. It's only hunger until we share." He swallowed. The room did that thing again, where everything else went to the edges. He looked at her. "Did you write this?" "We did," she said, glancing at Alina across the room, then back. "Me and my brother and my sister and my mom. We thought the rules should change now." He laughed, and then he didn't laugh at all, because some sentences rearrange a person at the level of their blueprints. He folded the paper and gave it back, and then he reached into his wallet and took out the first paper, the one with dents that had taught him how to aim. "I carry this every day," he said, and watched her eyes widen, like he had told her the moon had been in his pocket all along. Could I carry the new one too?" She considered, because leadership must be learned young, in houses where breakfast has to be negotiated. She nodded. "But you have to promise to follow the rules." "I will," he said, and he meant it. In the spring, the board made the program permanent and expanded it to all district schools. The kitchen doubled, then tripled its capacity. Other districts sent people to watch and take notes. Some took the model home and built their own. Others shook hands and said it was inspiring, and went back to buying the cold shame. Change, he realized, is as temperamental as a teenager, but as inevitable as a sunrise if you can keep the lights on long enough. They invited families to a community meal to celebrate the first year. Long tables outside under strings of lights, the air soft, the sky forgiving. Children ran with the kind of freedom you only get when your blood sugar is stable. A band played in a corner, an accordion fighting with a trumpet, and somehow winning. He gave a short speech and made it shorter, because the smell of roasted chicken makes speeches offensive. Alina stood beside him, her arm linked in his like they were old friends at a wedding. Miss Ramirez brought a tray to the table instead of waiting to be served, and joked that she would keep her day job as principal, but apply to be a dessert taste tester in the summer. Grace came and sat with the cafeteria workers and learned how to play a card game with rules that changed depending on who was winning. At the end of the night, when the kids were sticky and the adults were full and the lights found the dust and turned it into glitter, Maya climbed on a chair and tapped a cup with a spoon. The room quieted because the room already knew whose voice had set all of this in motion. "We want to say thank you," she said, and her brother held her hand steady like he had been holding her steady all his life.